Hey everybody, this is Darren Van Dam, and you are watching Flick Connection, the show that helps you get more out of movies, and today we're going to be talking about 20 mind-bending movies you can currently catch on Netflix. So this is going to be a list of 20 movies where I spend about a minute per movie. They're all mind-bending movies currently available on Netflix. We've got some sci-fi, some twisted thrillers, and some of the absolute weirdest movies you can currently catch on Netflix. But let's go ahead and start this list all the way at the back at number 20 with a Netflix original starring Sam Worthington called Fractured. Now this one slipped way under the radar and was not really a big deal when it came out, and I kind of can't see why. I mean, that's why it's at number 20, but for a lot of you this will make for a great brain-bending movie. There are a lot of twists and turns in this. In this movie, Sam Worthington's daughter is in a really awful accident and he has to take her to a hospital. This is like the first 5 minutes of the movie, and then weirder and weirder things start happening at this hospital, and he not only becomes very frustrated, he becomes very confused and begins to question his sense of reality. Now the reason this one's back at number 20 is I did see a lot of stuff coming in this movie because it is a lot of things I've seen in some other movies, but I watch an ungodly amount of movies, so that's probably why I think there are a lot of twists in this a lot of people will not see coming. I didn't figure them out because I'm a genius, I figured them out because I'd seen them before. But if the concept sounds interesting to you, I would give this one a shot. My number 19 pick also did some things seen in other movies, but it does have Johnny Depp in it, and it is a lot more interesting than Fractured. It is Secret Window. Now, this is far from my favorite Johnny Depp movie, but it is a cool little thriller with a good twist, but it's also got some really interesting things along the way, including a really bonkers role from John Turturro. And honestly, I like him more than Johnny Depp, so it was cool to see him play this character in the movie. And overall, while this is a crowd pleaser movie, it can be a little bit of a mediocre thriller, which is why it's at number 19, but if you want to watch something weird with some twists and turns and you never bothered to watch Secret Window, it is a good flick, especially for something that's just included on Netflix right now. The newest movie on this list just came out a few weeks ago as a Netflix original. It stars Jake Gyllenhaal. It's called The Guilty. Now, this is actually a remake of a Danish movie that's only a few years old by the same name, and it is not quite a shot-for-shot remake, but it is a very, very true remake. I do think the Danish version is better, and not just because it was the original. I was much more glued to my seat. Now that may be because I had actually seen this story unfold already. I do think Jake Gyllenhaal did a good job, per usual, and then Antoine Fuqua was the director. I always like his work, but I don't think he improved upon the original with this one. Now, don't get me wrong, I do recommend the Netflix original. However, if you're interested in watching the original Danish version, it is also included with Hulu right now, and it may be a better way to go if you're not allergic to subtitles. All the way from 1995, one of the older ones on this particular list is Johnny Mnemonic. This was just recently added to Netflix, but it is a classic cyberpunk movie starring Keanu Reeves. And oddly enough, The Matrix 4 is about to release. This could be a good watch before that because it does have a lot in common with The Matrix. Not just Keanu Reeves, plot-wise there's a lot in common, but also you get a chance to really see how Keanu Reeves has not really aged at all in the last 25 years. My next pick is actually a Netflix original from back before they were promoting Netflix originals. You'll remember the movie Bright was kind of the first big one that they pushed and did a release, but before that they had a handful that they really released under the radar, and one of my favorites from that period is Shimmer Lake. Now this one's really interesting because everything happens in reverse, very similar to Christopher Nolan's Memento, except this one doesn't involve memory loss or anything. You're just going back through a crime day by day over the course of a week, and you're learning what actually happened because you're going back in reverse order. It's the perfect way to tell this particular story. Now, this movie's far from flawless. It's got really weird pacing, and I think that's mostly a result from the unusual structure. And it's also kind of strange because it's got quite a few comedy actors in it. They're doing things that are a little bit funny, but for the most part, they're playing things very straight, and it's a little bizarre that there are so many comedy actors in this movie. I would relate this the most to movies like Fargo. It's got a dark, sort of true crime edge to it with some levity that's not quite knee slapper funny, but that's grounded in a way that's very similar to Fargo. Obviously, it's not nearly as good of a movie, but fans of Fargo, I think you're gonna find a lot to love with Shimmer Lake. Some people get mad at me for dissing this next pick, but I will remind you, it's on the list. I do recommend this movie. There are some caveats, though, to Sucker Punch. This is directed by Zack Snyder. He's famous for movies like 300, Watchmen, Batman vs. Superman, and the Zack Snyder Justice League, but I do find Sucker Punch to be one of his more interesting projects. Now, I do find also that the story gets pretty lost along the way. In fact, the story is fairly thin on this one. I could describe it in about 10 seconds, but you get amazing visuals with this one. Now, I realize they're all animated. This is almost like watching an adult animated movie. However, you go into it with that mindset, like you're watching something like Heavy Metal or something like that, then Sucker Punch is a really cool watch. You just can kind of unplug your brain for it for the most part. Now, my next pick is the complete opposite of that. It too has really great visuals, but you need to really have your brain plugged into this one because it is unusually hard to follow. Speaking of The Matrix 4, I'm talking about another film from the Wachowskis, Cloud Atlas. Now, this is based on a book by the same name that is a notoriously hard book to read, and the movie is an equally hard thing to understand. Not necessarily because you have to be super smart to understand what's going on. It is so layered and complicated that it is just very, very difficult to follow if you're not really glued into it. You switch from story to story, almost like an anthology, except they're layered up and they have a lot in common with each other. In that respect, I have a lot of respect for this movie. It's a big undertaking, and they almost nailed it. The movie does get wobbly and wonky because of its real complicated structure, but just like Sucker Punch, it's filled with amazing visuals, and the story is quite interesting if you can stay glued into it for the almost 3-hour runtime. Now, those are two big budget Hollywood movies, a lot of money on the screen. My next pick is an indie flick, but it is sci-fi and has some great visuals, but also more importantly, it's got a really interesting story and concept. That is Synchronic. Now, this is the latest movie from Moorhead and Benson, and I just talked about one of my favorite movies of theirs, Spring. It's currently free on Tubi. I'll put a link to that video in the description of this one if you didn't get a chance to check that one out. But Synchronic has some really interesting ways of dealing with time travel. I won't say too much more about it, but it does it in a very different way than I've ever seen in a movie before, and they made it work. Anthony Mackie does a good job here, and something that's really interesting about this project is it was done on an independent budget, and after it was completed, Moorhead and Benson, the creators, decided to put a bunch of their own money into it to completely re-edit it. And when you watch it, you can see why. It's got a very disjointed editing style, but it works. I even didn't really notice it too much the first time. It didn't disrupt the movie. It flowed so well, but on a second viewing, it's incredibly disjointed. So it's impressive not only that they made that work, but that they went right back into the movie and re-edited it because they felt like it was the best decision for the movie. You gotta respect that. If you liked Synchronic, then I highly recommend my next sci-fi pick, Freaks, which is another very small movie with some fantastic visual effects, but also a fantastic concept. Now, for this one, I cannot describe the concept to you because you don't really know what's going on in this movie till you get towards the end. But Emile Hirsch stars in this along with Bruce Dern. There's a very young girl who's really the main character, and she does a really great job of carrying this. And you don't see kids that age really carrying smaller movies very often, but this has got some very, very bizarre elements to it, yet it's got fantastic world building. In fact, I would gladly watch more than one sequel to this because there was so much detail in the story and the world that we're in. I wanted to see more of it because the movie Freaks is on a fairly small scale, not just because of the budget, but the story really focuses on this father-daughter relationship. And again, it works quite well and is a real surprise of a sci-fi movie. My number 11 pick is not the last sci-fi movie on this list, but it's the last one we'll talk about for a few minutes. It stars Ryan Reynolds and Ben Kingsley in Selfless. In this movie, Ben Kingsley plays a billionaire who is desperately trying to extend his life. He undergoes this experimental procedure and is transported into the body of a much younger man played by Ryan Reynolds. Now, That is the setup, and the delivery of this movie is quite good. Now, just like some of the other ones I talked about, this is a smaller movie done on a smaller budget, you can tell, but Ryan Reynolds does a great job. He's classic Ryan Reynolds at times with a little bit of humor, but for the most part, he plays this pretty straight, and it's not as boring as it might sound. And keep in mind, he's technically playing Ben Kingsley's part. And while Selfless does have a little bit in common with movies like Face Off, it's not an all-out action movie. There is some action in it, but this is much more of a sci-fi movie where you're following the story with minimal action. So don't let some of the footage I'm showing you deceive you. But it all worked together really well, and I do consider it to be one of the better indie sci-fi movies currently available on Netflix. Before moving on to my top 10, I know some of you have questions about this shirt. I get a bunch of questions every time I wear it on screen. So there is a link in the description where you can get this shirt. Not only can you get it, but it is a link that gives a little bit of kickback to the channel. So it's a great way to support the channel without actually having to give anything up. And if you don't want the shirt, you can just go follow that link and then do your Amazon shopping, and the channel will still get a kickback, and it's totally on the up and up. But let's go ahead and move on with the top 10 on this list.
What happened at the motel? People started dying.
So I mentioned some twisted thrillers, and Identity is just that. Now, I do consider this to not be a very rewatchable movie because there are so many twists. Once they're spoiled for you, the movie's not nearly as interesting as it is on a first watch. However, if you've never seen this is a wild ride, and it has a really packed cast. I mean, John Cusack, Ray Liotta, Amanda Peet, John Hawkes, one of my favorite actors, Alfred Molina, and this is directed by James Mangold, who would go on to direct movies like 3:10 to Yuma, Logan, and Ford vs. Ferrari. But in this movie, a bunch of strangers meet at this motel during a storm, and they start to discover they might not be as strange to each other as they originally thought. There's some wild stuff that unfolds in this one. It's a lot of fun to watch. It's not quite a horror movie, even though it does have some scares in it. So if you find that you typically get too scared from horror movies, this could be a good way to dip your toe in the water. Now we're gonna switch things up in a big way with one of the sexiest thrillers of all time, Wild Things. Now this is one of the sexiest thrillers of all time because Denise Richards and Neve Campbell are both at peak hotness, and there are some intense sex scenes in this movie. But that's not the only reason to watch it. Keep in mind, this is my number 9 ranked movie. It does make for a really interesting, twisted thriller. Again, just loaded with sex. But not just sex. I mean, Bill Murray plays an injury attorney with a neck brace on for most of the movie. And while that is plenty funny, and there's plenty of funny moments in the movie, it does deal with some heavy subject matter. So there's a lot going on in this one, and it is a popular movie. By no means is this a hidden gem, but I think because it's so sexually charged, a lot of people forget how good the thriller elements of Wild Things actually are. All right, we're gonna jump back into sci-fi with one from the 90s that really still holds up better than you would have expected, Stargate. Now, this one did have some cutting-edge visual effects when it came out, and it was quite popular and went on to spawn multiple TV series, but didn't quite gain, I think, the popularity it maybe could have to spawn big-budget sequel movies. That said, Stargate deals with interdimensional travel and has some really interesting visuals surrounding pyramids with some ancient Egyptian-inspired aliens, I guess, for lack of a better word. Incredible visuals, sets. Kurt Russell leads this off. Great role from him. And it's just a pretty good, well-rounded PG-13 action movie from the 90s that you could easily watch with some older kids without giving them ferocious nightmares. But one you definitely don't want to watch with the kids, and honestly, you may not even want to watch if you have kids, is What Dreams May Come. This is one of the darkest, grimmest movies Robin Williams was ever in, yet at the same time, it's filled with some of the most absolutely beautiful visuals you're gonna see on Netflix right now. In this movie, Robin Williams plays a family man who loses both of his children and then dies tragically in a car accident. I know, like I said, it's really heavy stuff, but he goes to heaven. This is actually based on a book by the same name and has some beautiful depictions of heaven that are very different from anything else you've seen in a movie before. Cuba Gooding Jr. also stars in this, and it's got a wonderful mix of these beautiful visions of heaven and these nightmarish visions of hell. And a lot of the sets and things that you see are done practically with miniatures and actual sets and costumes, and it looks real. It looks tactile for most of the movie, and that's really what makes this movie work. Now, it does have a very, very good story, but like I said, it's incredibly heavy, and it is going to weigh on most people who watch this movie. So watch it with some caution, but again, just a stunning visual feast with a really good role from Robin Williams in it as well. Alright, now I promise there was weird ones on this list, and far and away the weirdest one on the list, weirdest one on Netflix, and probably the weirdest movie to come out last year is I'm Thinking of Ending Things. Now, a primer for this is that it is directed by Charlie Kaufman, but Charlie Kaufman is most famous for having written the screenplays for movies like Adaptation, Being John Malkovich, and Eternal Sunshine of the Spotless Mind. This is his third movie to direct, and easily his best. This also is a very difficult movie to watch because it's very difficult to decipher what is actually going on for most, if not all, of the movie. In fact, I would wager that the percentage of people that understood this movie in any kind of way as soon as the credits roll have got to be in the single digits and possibly even down in the 1 percentile. It's that weird of a movie, but there is enough there to understand if you get into it and if you contemplate it afterwards. Meaning, Charlie Kaufman gives you all the clues you need to understand what's actually going on. Not only that, you've got amazing performances from Jesse Plemons, Toni Collette, Jesse Buckley, and David Thewlis. They're all fantastic in this. And again, Charlie Kaufman's brain works differently than maybe anybody else's. The way that he handled this is just so bizarre, yet it somehow worked. I was enthralled the entire way through, could not wait to see what happened next. It is far and away one of the most interesting Netflix originals I've ever seen. It is not for everybody. A lot of people would probably be disappointed by this movie, but if I piqued your interest and you like really bizarre stuff, strap in, watch this one, and do your best to understand what the f is going on. Another one that's almost equally as weird as I'm Thinking of Ending Things, but significantly darker, is The Machinist, starring Christian Bale. Now, in this movie, Christian Bale actually got down to the weight that you see. I mean, he's my height and he's barely over 100 pounds. He's completely emaciated, lost all muscle mass, and he did this for the role, and I think he would have done a good job with makeup, but the weight loss definitely sells it, and it is a wild sort of Twilight Zone type of a ride. There's weird characters that may or may not be real. The sky is always brooding and dark, but this is one that I consider to be highly rewatchable. All the little twists and turns are so interesting, they're interesting to watch multiple times. The big twist in this movie is not ruined for you by multiple viewings. If anything, the movie might be a little bit enhanced. So if you enjoyed this one once, I would take a stab at it again and see if you enjoy it even more the second time around. Now, my top 4 picks are very popular movies. They're among some of the more popular things on Netflix, but they're all well worth watching. That's why they're in the top 4. My number 4 pick comes from 1990, and it still holds up today as a fantastic ghost movie, Ghost. Now, technically, this is not really a ghost movie. This is really a romantic movie starring Patrick Swayze and Demi Moore. And while I'm not really a big fan of Demi Moore, I am a big fan of Patrick Swayze. I love seeing him in everything, and this is one of his flagship movies. Not only is this a romantic movie, that's a great date night movie. I mean, I cannot recommend enough. If you need a good date night at home, put Ghost on, I'm doing you a favor. But it's also a really cool flick. This was nominated for multiple Academy Awards in multiple categories the year it came out, including visual effects. Whoopi Goldberg, I believe, won an Academy Award for her role as this fortune teller character, and she was perfect for this character. But it is a solid flick, which is why it has held up so long over time, and it is one I do not see on streaming services often. It's been on Netflix for several months, but it is likely going to leave soon, so make sure you watch it, especially if you've never seen it. All right, we're gonna deal with time travel for the last time on this list with one of the latest big budget movies Netflix has added, Looper. Like all movies about time travel, there are plenty of plot holes you can poke in it, but this is one of the best movies Bruce Willis has done in the last 10 years. That man has moved on to almost exclusively dog shit movies, but Looper is incredible for a bunch of reasons. One, it was written and directed by Rian Johnson, who did a handful of movies I really liked. In fact, I like everything this guy did, except for The Last Jedi. If you've never seen it though, this takes place in the future where time travel has not yet been invented, yet it's been invented in their future, and people from that future travel back to this future, and it gets really twisted, and I don't feel like this movie goes through loads of exposition the way that Christopher Nolan movies do. Meaning much of the exposition really comes out organically in the story itself, so that's another way that this movie is seamless. It's got a cool look to it. Joseph Gordon-Levitt looks unusual because he is playing the young Bruce Willis. I think they did a great job of making him look like he could have been that character without making him look the way Bruce Willis used to look in the 80s. They had good chemistry together, and Bruce Willis's character is fairly different from anything I've seen him play, or at least the character arc was fairly different. I thought that was really interesting. So there's a ton of great stuff about this movie. This is another one. If you've seen it once, it is well worth multiple viewings, so do yourself a favor and go check it out on Netflix before it's gone, because this is another one that is probably not going to stay around too long. My next pick is directed by David Fincher, easily one of my favorite directors, and one of his most underrated movies is The Game. Now, longtime subscribers, I know I've talked about this quite a few times lately, but it's because it is one of my favorite movies currently available on Netflix, and it's one of my favorite things to recommend because while I know a lot of people have seen and loved this movie, it is one of David Fincher's more underrated movies, and I think there are still a lot of people who are going to discover this on Netflix that are going to be completely blown away by it. In this movie, Michael Douglas plays a millionaire, hedge fund type guy who goes to this company that is going to turn your life into a game. Sounds fun enough, but this game is very difficult, almost impossible to decipher from your real life, and it becomes increasingly impossible for his character to tell whether or not his life is in danger or whether he's the part of an elaborate game where his life is in no danger. It's very twisted stuff, and a director like David Fincher managed to nail this. I mean, when I think of my favorite actors, he's not one that comes to mind, but he's so good, he makes everything so seamless. I never regret watching him in anything, and this is probably my favorite movie that he's in. If you generally like my recommendations here on this channel and you've somehow never seen The Game, not only can I not recommend it enough, I strongly urge you to make it the next movie you watch. Okay, the theme of this video is mind-bending movies, and my number one pick is not only one of the most mind-bending things you can currently catch on Netflix, I think it's one of the best executed movies of its kind. I'm talking about Martin Scorsese's Shutter Island. Now, if you didn't know, this is actually based on a book by Dennis Lehane, who also wrote the novels Mystic River and Gone Baby Gone. So his books get turned into fantastic movies, and Shutter Island is no exception. The reason it makes number one, though, is because of the way Martin Scorsese directed this movie. I've said it a couple of times on this video already. Some of these movies are better the second time around. Shutter Island is the best example of that I think I've ever seen in a movie. There are twists that are spoiled for you after one viewing, but they unlock the secrets that Martin Scorsese put into this movie. What I'm talking about is subtleties in performances, subtleties in little props, little clues along the way that basically give away the main twist. Little things though, things completely undetectable. Meaning a performance where someone's a little bit nervous where maybe they shouldn't be. Something you totally would have overlooked the first time around, yet the second time around, all of this stuff is illuminated and it is a completely different viewing experience. I highly recommend, if you've seen this movie, to revisit it on Netflix. If you need a refresher of kind of what happens, that way all of those things are kind of revealed to you, I recommend looking up the twist if it's been a while. If you've never seen it, watch it once. If you like it, watch it again and you will probably love it. It's that good, and it does require a director like this and actors like these to bring something like this to life. so perfectly. I would say this is far from my favorite Martin Scorsese movie, yet I'm able to really gush about it and talk about the way that he directed it, more so than maybe anything else he's ever done, because it is almost a magic trick that he pulls off in this movie. It's really fantastic stuff. In addition to that, on the first watch, it's just a really great mystery movie with incredible performances and production design. So it is a great movie from the beginning, and even better somehow afterwards. But that is the list of 20. Hopefully you come away from this video with plenty more recommendations than you would ever come across if you spent the same amount of time scrolling through Netflix. If you appreciate that, let me know by clicking the like button, maybe even sharing this video. Hell, you may even want to become a Patreon supporter and see your name here displayed at the end of every video. There's a link to Patreon in the video description below, as well as a link where you could get my Snakeskin shirt. But I will keep making these videos as long as you keep watching them. Thanks for checking out this special mind-bending episode, and you will see me on the next one.